You're in my mind, I'ma be okay. A little love goes a long way. So I'm going within today. I'm going within today. You're in my mind, I'ma be okay. A little love goes a long way. So I'm going within today.
Greetings, my beautiful inner workers. Today we're talking about something that sounds very beautiful in theory, but becomes incredibly complicated when real pain is attached to it. Forgiveness. It's not the performative kind of forgiveness. It's not the kind of forgiveness that's forced. It's not just the quote unquote move on kind people love to preach when they've never had their heart genuinely wounded. I'm talking about real forgiveness, the kind that takes time, the kind that wrestles with grief, the kind that asks you to confront the pain without allowing it to calcify into something bitter. But more specifically, we're talking about forgiveness without reconciliation. You're listening to the Going Within podcast with me, your host, Sheena C. This is a space for self-awareness, for healing, and learning to actually trust your own inner voice. Because I think a lot of people confuse forgiveness and reconciliation. They think that forgiving someone, it means that you reconnect and you restore access and you're rebuilding trust. Some people think that it's pretending that nothing ever happened. Come on. Or reopening doors that destroyed their peace in the first place. Right? And honestly, that misunderstanding, it keeps a lot of people emotionally trapped because they feel like, they feel pressured to choose between healing and self-protection. But forgiveness and reconciliation are not synonymous. Okay? They are entirely different processes. Forgiveness is more internal and reconciliation is more relational. Well, forgiveness is more about releasing resentment. So it no longer keeps you in some kind of prison, right? And on contrast, reconciliation requires accountability. It requires safety, consistency, and emotional maturity, and also mutual effort. And not every relationship has the structural integrity to rebuild, okay? That can be rebuilt. And that's the truth that people tend to avoid, because sometimes the healthiest thing that you can do is forgive someone, okay? And still love them from a distance. Sometimes healing means releasing hatred without reestablishing access. And I know that can feel emotionally, dissonant at first, because people tend to think in extremes, either I hate them forever or we completely restore the relationship. But life is more nuanced than that. There's a middle ground, okay? And there's a mature ground, a grounded ground, so to speak, where you can say things like, you know what, I no longer want revenge against you, but I also no longer trust you with my emotional well-being. And that's where wisdom kicks in. It's not cruel. It's not a form of cruelty. It's wisdom. And today we're going to really sit with that idea. Okay. So one of the most damaging ideas people internalize about forgiveness is the idea that forgiveness means forgetting, right? Well, it doesn't. Forgiveness is not spiritual amnesia. You don't, have to erase your memory in order for you to heal. And honestly, sometimes remembering is what protects you from repeating the cycles, right? Because you remember. Painful experiences teach us discernment. They reveal patterns. They expose misalignment. They sharpen your awareness. Okay? Now, of course, staying consumed by pain indefinitely is unhealthy. But pretending something didn't wound you isn't healing either. That's suppression. And with suppression has a way of resurfacing later through anxiety, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, or misplaced anger. Real forgiveness acknowledges reality fully. It says, yes, this hurts me. Yes, it changed me. Yes, I experienced betrayal, disappointment. I experienced abandonment. I experienced manipulation, dishonesty, whatever it may have been, right? And then eventually, I no longer want this pain to govern my inner world. It comes to that. That's forgiveness, not pretending that it never happened. And I think people need permission to understand that, because too many people force themselves, into premature forgiveness while their nervous system is still screaming for safety. You get what I'm saying? That's not transcendence. That's emotional self-abandonment that is disguised as some form of spirituality. True forgiveness is not performative fragility, right? It's more so emotional liberation, right? You want to be free from that emotion that's pulling you. So, a lot of us were conditioned to believe that quote unquote good people, always give second chances. That kindness means endless access. That compassion requires tolerating repeated harm over and over. And because of that conditioning, many people feel guilty for establishing, healthy boundaries after forgiving someone. But boundaries are not evidence of unforgiveness. I'll say that again. Boundaries are not evidence of unforgiveness. Sometimes the boundaries are evidence that forgiveness finally taught you something. You can release the resentment while still recognizing the incompatibility, right? You can pray for someone's healing, right? And still acknowledge that they are unsafe for your life. That's emotional maturity, because reconciliation requires more than apology. It requires you to transform. It requires you to change. And transformation is demonstrated through patterns, not promises. Anybody can say, hey, I've changed. But sustainable change reveals itself through consistency over time, through accountability and through humility and through behavioral congruence. And unfortunately, some people want the aesthetics of the reconciliation without the labor of the repair. They want the immediate access restored because the discomfort makes them feel uneasy. But trust is not rebuilt through the urgency of the matter. Trust rebuilds slowly, right? And sometimes it never fully returns back. Okay? And that's being real about it. That's just life. That's just how it is. Because certain betrayals after the architecture of the connection permanently, not always maliciously, but realistically, and accepting that it's part of emotional adulthood, right? This is something I had to learn deeply myself. Okay? You can wish someone well without inviting them back into your life. You know, past relationships, I had to release them, let them go, wish them well, but not allow them to even be a friend anymore. I don't want friendship or any type of connection to you. Okay? Those are not contradictions because peace does not require proximity. And to be honest, some people become healthier for you at a distance. You know, not because they're evil or, wicked people, not because you hate them or anything, but because the dynamic itself, it became corrosive. Some connections slowly erode your nervous system. You start second guessing yourself constantly. You're walking on eggshells. You're not even feeling comfortable in your own home, feeling emotionally, dysregulated around them, over explaining things, suppressing yourself, losing your clarity. And eventually your spirit becomes exhausted from trying to maintain a connection that no longer feels emotionally safe. And that's very, very important to take heed of, because forgiveness should not require self-betrayal. If reconnecting with someone consistently destabilizes your peace, you are allowed to honor that information. You are allowed to choose distance. Okay? You're allowed to choose those things without hatred in your heart, without vengeance in your mind, without malice. Just clarity. And clarity is a very powerful thing because clarity doesn't yell or scream, right? It doesn't need theatrics. Clarity is just simply saying, hey, you know what? I understand now. That's all. That's it. And I think sometimes people romanticize forgiveness like it happens overnight. Okay, but deep wounds don't heal instantly, especially when betrayal was involved, especially when trust was broken repeatedly. You gave them chance after chance, especially when the pain already altered your perception of yourself. Sometimes forgiveness unfolds in layers, like an onion. At first, maybe all you can do is stop replaying revenge fantasies in your mind. Then maybe you stop obsessively revisiting them, revisiting what they did, the pain, that they caused. Then maybe you stop needing them to suffer in order for you to feel okay. Then eventually, the emotional charge starts to soften. Okay? Not necessarily because of what happened became acceptable, but because your spirit no longer wants to carry the burden of resentment everywhere you go. And that's growth. And I think people need to stop judging themselves for, not wanting to forgive immediately. Some pain requires grieving. It needs a grieving period, right? Before you can even release, before a release is even possible. And grief deserves patience. You cannot rush emotional integration. You cannot spiritually bypass devastation. Your nervous system has to process what happened. And your heart has to metabolize the disappointment, if you know what I mean. Your identity has to reorganize itself around what changed. And those things take time. It's not a one and done thing, And to be honest, sometimes forgiveness begins simply by deciding, right? What are you deciding? You decide, hey, look, I no longer want this pain to consume my entire inner world, right? And that small shift matters a lot, more than we know. And this is probably, one of the hardest forms of forgiveness. Forgiving people who never acknowledge the damage that they did. Because part of us feel like, hey, if they never admitted it, why should I let it go? I know you feel like that. We all have that moment where we're like, why should I let it go? They never even said sorry. They never even admitted it, acknowledged it even, And that feeling is very understandable. It's very relatable because validation matters. Accountability matters. Being seen accurately matters. But unfortunately, not everybody possesses the emotional depth required for accountability. And that's the sad part. Not everybody does. Some people avoid guilt at all costs. Some rewrite narratives to protect their ego. Some tend to minimize harm because facing it would fracture the image they have of themselves. And waiting indefinitely for emotionally unavailable people to suddenly become emotionally mature, that can keep you emotionally imprisoned. Okay, at some point you realize their inability to apologize properly is a reflection of their limitations, not your worthiness. Right? And that realization changes things because now forgiveness stops being about whether they deserve it, and then it becomes about whether you deserve peace. And that's the shift. Forgiveness is not always for the other person. Me personally, I think it's mostly for you. It's for your nervous system, your sleep, your emotional freedom, your future relationships. You don't want to repeat the cycle and bring that baggage into another relationship. Your ability to experience joy without dragging old pain into every new chapter that you begin. And resentment is a very, very heavy feeling. And prolonged bitterness will quietly contaminate the person that's carrying it. It doesn't happen immediately, but gradually. And that's why in my Reiki practice, my clients, I notice, a lot of the times they're carrying very, very old stuff. Very, very old baggage that have consumed them over the years, and it's like it calluses, it calluses, and over time, that emotional pain and grief sadness, anger, it turns into physical ailments. They end up having to go to a doctor because their energy center that's associated with those emotions have now been fractured, and they now need physical attention. And I personally believe that most ailments begin in the spiritual realm. It's a spiritual thing. It comes from the emotions, then it materializes into the physical when left undiagnosed, unnoticed, when just left undealt with. And, that's the thing. It hardens the softness in you. It distorts, the perception that you may have. It creates emotional, rigidity. And while anger is, valid temporarily, living there permanently becomes corrosive. Like I said with my Reiki clients, it becomes corrosive, seriously. So eventually you have to ask yourself, do I want to keep carrying this? Not because they earned this release, but because you, the individual who's carrying this, you deserve liberation. One thing nobody talks about enough is that forgiveness should increase discernment. It shouldn't erase it, because healing is supposed to make you wiser. It's supposed to make you more attuned, more aware, and more intentional about access. Who has access to you? It shouldn't make you more naive, right? Sometimes after healing, you realize things like, I can love people, deeply and still recognize that they are just not aligned with my well-being. And that's profound maturity itself. Emotionally immature people often tend to confuse love with unlimited tolerance. But healthy love includes discernment. Healthy love includes boundaries. It includes self-respect. One of the deepest acts of self-love is refusing to repeatedly place yourself in environments that's continuously wounding you. Okay? Even if you care about people involved. Because compassion without boundaries will become self-destruction. And many people don't realize that they've been overextending empathy while neglecting themselves entirely. Healing changes that. It teaches balance. It teaches reciprocity, right? It teaches that your peace matters too. So maybe forgiveness isn't about, pretending that the pain never existed. Maybe it's about refusing to let the pain become your permanent identity. Maybe it's about saying what happened to me, it mattered, right? It affected me deeply. But I no longer want to carry this resentment like an inheritance, right? And maybe reconciliation isn't always the goal. Maybe sometimes the lesson is simply release. No return. Because some doors close, and they don't close out of punishment to you, but more so protection. And some people can be forgiven without being reinvited into your inner world. That does not make you a cold person. It makes you someone who's discerning. Okay? So if you're listening to this while struggling with forgiveness, take your time. Be honest with yourself. Don't force healing for appearances. Don't confuse those boundaries with the bitterness. and don't let anyone pressure you into reconnecting before you trust. You know, safety and consistency is something that actually exists, and you are allowed to forgive quietly. You're allowed to heal privately. And you are absolutely allowed to protect your peace afterward, because forgiveness is not surrendering, your self respect. It's reclaiming your freedom from the pain, and sometimes the most profound form of healing is learning how to release someone emotionally without reopening the door, the door that they once walked through carelessly. Okay, so that's it for today, guys. And before I go, I just want to ask for your help with the podcast growth by simply liking, subscribing on whatever platform you're listening on. Leave a comment, a like, a share. This helps us to spread awareness and reach the people who needs to hear it. So thank you so much for your support and your love. I appreciate each and every one of you for listening. And I'll talk to you in the next episode. So stay safe, stay positive, stay healthy. I love you, and namaste. Ciao.
I'm going within today.